Welcome to the Awakening and the Crypto podcast. And you'll understand why I'm actually combining both of these. The guest that I'm going to bring on will be talking about professional tax. He's classed as a professional tax evader, undocumented motorist, and a life-saving drug smuggler. And just before I introduce him, I just want to say that I didn't get shows out for about a month because I had an accident. I slipped on ice in my garden and I fractured my spine, my vertebrae, and my pelvis. So I'm wearing a brace, hence why I don't usually wear clothes like this. And that's why the shows haven't gone out. Find everything about me, scan the QR code, go to roycollin.com. And if you're looking for virtual assistants, go to va.world. Now, my guest, I've read his book, Crash the Fed, The Only Way to End It, and he's known as Dan Taxation Is Theft Behrman. That's the correct way I usually chat. So I'm looking forward to this because I totally agree with you. So welcome to the show, Dan.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no problem. So I suppose, like, one of the things that you ran for the presidential election in 2020, so that'll grab people's attention straight away. But before we kind of delve into that, I want to know, how did this all come about that you kind of realize taxation? What was your journey into kind of realizing something's up?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always kind of been defiant, and when I was younger, I had like an entrepreneurial spirit, so I was trying to start businesses, and I was always being told, well, you have to make sure you register with the government, you get your business license and your tax forms, excuse me, and yeah, and I was just like, wait a minute, so you're telling me out of this little bit of money that I'm going to make, I have to collect extra money and give it to the government, and then out of my profits, I have to give them even more, and it just didn't make sense to me. So, just being a little bit defiant, I kind of resisted the idea, and as I get older, I kind of figured out how do I push back. And of course, the first thing that were my first opportunity to actually push back was when I started getting traffic tickets when I got my driver's license. So yeah, it's really just kind of always been there with me. And then, having these conversations with these people who try to tell me that I have to participate in this, they never really had a good explanation that I could accept and say like, oh, that makes sense. It was always like, it still sounds like I'm getting robbed here. How are you guys okay with this?
So I suppose, like with my own journey, I ended up losing everything, just through banks, fraud, and everything. When the crash happened, it took a bit later. And I just saw so much corruption. It was like, there's something going on. Like, I realized they turned off the tap. They printed the press so people with a pulse were getting money. And then professionals couldn't even get a mortgage. And it was kind of by looking at that, I saw there's something seriously wrong. And then I started getting guests on. BB Backus was one. She was talking about UCC. Unfortunately, she just passed last year. But I done a course with her. Then I got different people on. And the more that I kind of went down the rabbit hole, I was kind of realizing there's so much fraud, and a lot of it was in the names. That's what I've kind of realized. Everything they're doing, they go with the all capitals. So it's like Mr. Roy Collin or all capitals Roy Collin. And when you kind of question that, that's when they started backing off. And I've had a lot of success with what I'm doing, but at the same time, kind of realizing not to share screenshots of what I'm doing because usually they're constantly trying to attack you. So, like with what you've done, like if we go to the motor side, we start there because in the UK, I have a friend, he's Irish, and he deregistered his car. He had to write away to the different departments because that's how they can repossess your car. That's how they can impose all these fines. And people thought, no way is he going to get away with this. This is about, I don't know, 5, 8 years. And he's even traveled from the UK to Ireland via ferry and got away, never had any hassle. So if we go down the car route, how did you, I suppose, deregister, or what was your process?
Yeah, that's interesting to hear. So first, I want to say like, because I know there's some crazy theories out there, and like I don't even particularly believe in the whole all caps thing. But what's interesting is that's kind of how I got into this, and at some point I was like, okay, this sounds like too crazy to be true. Let me put some of this to the test. And I had already been fighting traffic tickets, right? But it was more like I'm gonna go and I'm gonna try to argue with the cop and say like he couldn't possibly prove I was speeding or something like that. But then I started noticing some of the things that these people were saying about the all caps, which was they don't use real courts. And I started realizing that when I go to the traffic court to fight the ticket, they would come out and say, "Oh well, the judge isn't here today, but we have a temporary judge," or all these other things. And they they used a different language, but basically they were telling me was you're not going to get a trial today. We've set up a separate system that's going to look like a trial, and if you choose to participate, then you're going to end up owing us a bunch of money. And so I started, they give you an opportunity to object to that and figure out, well, what actually happens if you say like I don't want to participate in this. And so I think that was kind of the introduction to it. And what's interesting is because I know there are a lot of different theories on how and why this works, and there's no smoking gun, and it's designed that way, right? Like there's no law. People tell me, oh, if you don't need a driver's license to drive, prove it, right? They want to see a law in black and white that says, oh, this only applies to commercial drivers or something like that. That's not there, and that's by design, right? Like they're not going to tell us how to exercise our freedom. It's the same thing as when you get stopped by the police and they say, do you mind if we search your car? Like they don't tell you like, oh, you don't have to say yes, but do you mind if we search your car? They're not going to tell you what your rights are. Like in the US, they have the Miranda warning, which is after you're arrested, but they don't tell you that you actually have the right to remain silent before you're arrested. Um, and so there's a lot of like there's a lot of really interesting signs, but you're not going to see them unless you push back because that's just how the system is designed, right? They're designed to trick you to confess against yourself and surrender all of your rights. Like the reason, and I'm sure Ireland's a little bit different in all kinds of different ways, but every country has some sort of Bill of Rights. And the only reason they put that there in the first place is the people who created that system knew tyrants are going to try to violate those rights at some point. And you need the same way people want a smoking gun in black and white yeah, that's not true. I don't need a driver's license. Um, the same reason they want something in black and white is the same reason those rights are written in our constitutions, to say that we have those rights, because if they weren't there, they'd be gone. I mean, even the ones that are there, like in the US, we have the right to bear arms, which pretty much is, clear. Okay, you can have guns. And even then in black and white, people are like, well, that only includes muskets, right? They'll try to stretch and change these things into very limited because that's what the government and the tyrants and the people in charge have coerced them into doing and have tricked them into believing. So, so yeah, it's really interesting, and that's I guess that's kind of been my path is you know um, I want to see something concrete myself because I've seen a lot of people try this, and I've seen a lot of people use arguments and strategies that don't necessarily work. We've all seen the people who they say I'm not driving, I'm traveling, and they end up getting pulled out of their car and arrested. And but at the same time, we've seen some really interesting videos. There was a guy who he said he said the same thing. He's like I'm not driving, I'm traveling. And but he was very calm. He wasn't combative with the police, which is one of the important things. Um, and the officer, he said, okay, but we can agree you're operating a motor vehicle, right? Now, I looked up the state that this was in. I think it was as Florida or Georgia, and I looked up what their laws were because all the states in the U.S. they have different, slightly different traffic laws. Some of them say driving is the key word, and some of them say operating is the key word. And in this state, operating was the key word. And this officer he asked him 5 or 6 times, but we can agree you're operating a motor vehicle, right? And this kid was smart enough he didn't know how to answer, but he was just like, he wasn't going to say yes. And because of that, the police officer kept asking, kept asking, and he couldn't do anything because he couldn't get that confession out of him. Now, everyone's looking for the smoking gun, and that's still not a smoking gun, but that's a pretty good indicator, right? If you're smart enough to see it, that's a pretty good indicator.
So when you kind of went through your process, did you have to do similar? So you don't have a driving license as such, or do you? Do
No.
you have? Yeah, because like yeah, I've heard of other people as well. They refuse to get that. So when you don't have that, do you then, when you get a car, because you have to get the registration from the car, which is technically you don't own it anymore. You know, that's what I'm seeing. So
Right.
did you deregister your car, or did you do anything in that sense?
Yeah. So when I first started doing this, the car I had at the time was registered, and I ended up unregistering it, and they fought me on it because I sent them a I was kind of learning from, all the information that was out there on the internet, right? And I found somebody had an example of a letter that you send to the DMV that says, I don't believe it needs to be registered. I don't need a license to drive, all this other stuff. And so therefore I want you to unregister the car. And they sent a letter back and they were like, no, that's crazy. Here's all the laws. And they gave me a bunch of cases to read. And at that point I had just kind of given up. I was like, well, I mean, if they won't even unregister the car, like, what am I supposed to do? But then I thought about it a little bit more and I looked into some of the laws and I said, okay, I'm not going to try to argue with them about, what my rights are because that's what happened, right? I sent them a letter to argue with them and they responded with an argument. Instead, I sent them a letter with instructions and I said, I want you to unregister this car. I want you to cancel my registration. And I think I mentioned I was taking it to a foreign jurisdiction, which from California could mean Nevada, right? Um, that was all that I said. And they unregistered the car. So the next time I got stopped, they said, we can't find the car in the system. And I'm like, well, that's because it's not registered. And that was kind of the end of and then they were like, okay, well, you need to go register it. And I was like, okay, sure. um, because like it's really interesting if you start digging into all the different state laws, like they even say it's okay to drive unregistered, for some 30-day period, right? And how do they know? Now, of course, this gets into the gray area because then people would say, okay, so that's fine for 30 days, but after that, well, first of all, they have the burden of proof. But even if I admit I had the car for more than 30 days, there's still nothing that really says that I have to register it if it's not for commercial purposes. But anyway, so I kind of did the same thing with the driver's license. I waited for it to expire. Um, at one point, I actually came down to Mexico, and I was kind of I lived in California, so Tijuana was the closest place. And you walk down there, and everybody's like, "What do you want? You want drugs? You want girls?" And I said, "No, I want a driver's license." And I was gonna try to, I was basically, I wasn't a resident. I was gonna try to bribe my way to a driver's license. And I found a guy who was like, "Okay, we can get you one." And it looked ridiculously fake, but I was like, okay, whatever. I tried, and I went back to the U.S. And the next time I was stopped, I used it and I gave it to the cop and I said, "Here's my license," because my understanding at this point was I was really starting to learn about jurisdiction, right? Well, you can write me a ticket, but you can't threaten to suspend my license for not paying it if you have no jurisdiction over my actual license, right? So, so I'm driving around with this Mexican driver's license and they're giving me tickets. Sometimes they're giving me tickets. Sometimes they're just like, ah, whatever, get out of here. Right. Um, one time only one time I was asked by a cop, he started speaking to me in Spanish and I was just like, my Spanish isn't that great. And he started looking at me really suspicious. This was in Texas now. Why do you have a Mexican driver's license if you don't speak Spanish? And I was just like, I have a vacation home down there. And I started like, just giving off this vibe, like, I'm a millionaire, man. I have houses are all around the world and, whatever, bro. And, that was kind of the end of it. And the only thing he had offense with was that I didn't have insurance. And this one, they even kind of tripped me up because, um, you really have to figure out how to answer these questions. The first cop I was dealing with the license issue, which eventually he was just like, okay, whatever. They didn't even end up writing me a ticket. What they ended up doing was taking the car because in Texas they're allowed to take the car if you don't have insurance. But this is what happened. The first cop, he asked if I had insurance, and I kind of avoided the question. I never really answered him. But when the second cop showed up, he asked, and for some reason I was distracted with the first cop, so I just said no. And so the second cop was just, he was already into the paperwork and everything else, because basically I was already playing their game instead of saying like, oh yeah, sure, I have insurance, it's not here, which some people say, oh yeah, but then you're lying. But or just not answering the question, to which point they wouldn't, because here's the thing, they can't take your car unless you don't have insurance, and they can't say you don't have insurance unless you admit to them you don't have it, right? um so there's, again, it's all these gray areas, and like all these questions that I shouldn't have to answer in the first place, that gives them the ability to do certain things. But anyway, I've got stopped other times, and as I got better at answering these questions, I even got stopped one time in Texas with no registration, no license, and spent an hour on the side of the road answering questions. um Ultimately, they gave me a ticket and said, here's a ticket for driving without a license. And when I showed up to the court to go fight it, they were like, oh, this ticket's already been voided. I said, what do you mean? And they pulled out the ticket from the back, and in big red marker it said void written across it. And I'm like, well, I didn't have a license and my car wasn't registered. This would have been a slam dunk. Why did they void it? Right? It's really interesting, all these things that start popping up. But again, no smoking gun, right? They didn't say, oh, we voided it because we realized he didn't need a license, right? They're not going to tell me that. Um, so yeah, it's just been like this constant journey of like evolving and learning, and kind of pushing back and actually testing to see, how much of this is actually true. And a surprising amount of it is like, you know, and I know there's a lot of conspiracy theories out there, and there's the sovereign citizens and all this other stuff. And I've looked into a lot of that stuff, and there's not, so like, for example, you brought up the all caps thing. Um, the closest I've seen is a law that requires all corporations must be written in all caps. But even that, it's not a hard rule. If you submit some, and this is for like the purpose of courts and everything, if you submit a brief to a court and you don't put it in all caps, like it doesn't matter. Like you're still going to state this is a corporation. It's obviously not a human's name, and it really doesn't change the course of anything. And I've also never seen anybody get out of a ticket by saying, or get out of any situation by saying, well, my name is in all caps. It's just like, it doesn't matter. We'll change it to all lowercase if it makes you feel better. It doesn't change anything. But what's interesting about that argument is, so are you telling me that the prosecutor could come in and say, they say, we have your birth certificate and all this other stuff, therefore we control you. Prosecutors never come in with a birth certificate and said, hey, we have it, therefore we control you, right? So like, um, so I see some of this stuff and I'm like, that's crazy. It doesn't really work. But there's so much information that's kind of around that it's like, if you separate that part of it and look at what's actually true and what actually does work, and that, I guess that's what I'm more interested in, right? Like, so, because some of it even sounds great in theory, like when we talk about some of the words and how they match up and everything. And I'm even into etymology, which is like the history of these words. But what I'm, I guess, most interested in is what actually works, and the how and the why aren't always apparent. And sometimes you just have to understand that, like, this is what works, and how and why isn't, it's relevant, it's important, but it's not always apparent. So you kind of just have to go based on, you have to kind of go without it sometimes. And I guess, yeah, I don't know. I could dig more into that a little bit, but, yeah, I think that's kind of, I think that's kind of it.
Yeah, well, a few things on the driving license, because I mean, I know other people that have done that as well. But the problem is then, if just say you go to Mexico and you want to hire a car, you're not going to get a car, or have you? Have you got a car? Have you been able to hire a car?
Actually. So, and every place is different, right? Like, everyone's more strict. I mean, so I have a passport now that I use for my ID wherever I go. And sometimes that's a problem. So, for the longest time, I was trying to get into the crypto world. Um, the exchanges were requiring that, you take a selfie, and they have this app that's all part of, this system, and they're connected to, whatever government systems to do background checks and KYC and everything else, which I absolutely hate all this stuff. But the point is, their software didn't handle passports at the time. So even though I had already had an account, I already had money in the exchange, and they now wanted this verification, I didn't have a driver's license. So they wouldn't verify my identification and basically locked me out of my account. And their customer service is impossible to connect to, right? So I was basically stuck until, a year later when they, the company, it was a third party service they were using, finally implemented passports. Um, so you have all these barriers. I went to Australia and at the airport, I bought a little SIM card and I was like, that was easy. And then I walk out of the airport, I stick it in my phone and I go through this activation process and I can't activate it without putting in my US tax ID, my social security. And I'm like, why does Australia need that? That's really weird. And I was like, can I put in a fake number? And I think I tried a couple fake numbers and they're verifying it against something, right? Because that wouldn't work. I had to give them my social just to get this SIM card to work. Um, so every place is different with the rules and everything. But Mexico is actually Mexico's getting pretty strict now because I did try to buy a car in Mexico. And this only started last year after Trump's tariff wars. You can't buy a car without giving them your tax ID and a letter from the tax office saying that you don't owe them anything. They won't sell it to you. You can buy it from, anybody on the street, but they won't sell it to you. And I'm like, I'm not asking for a loan. I'm going to pay cash, right? And they say, oh, well, it's anti-money laundering. And I'm like, well, it's not cash, it's a bank transfer. Because there used to be a law where if I paid in actual cash, they would have to, require that information. But now it's just, no, if you're going to buy a car at all, and I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. Um, so they have kind of put restrictions on it. And this I say it's Trump's tariff war because this actually like goes broader. I used to be able to order stuff. I'm in Mexico, by the way, for anyone who hasn't gathered that. When I order stuff on Amazon, if it comes from outside of Mexico, I'm required to put in a tax ID because they want to associate it for this import tax which they already had import taxes on everything, but now they want to really crack down and associate it. And I'm sure they put it there in place to make sure that we're importing less from the United States because that's part of the tariff war, right? We're not going to raise the taxes, we're just going to make it more difficult for people to import. So there's all these really interesting rules in place that make it different. But to get back to your point about can I rent a car, hire a car? I was able to do that in Mexico and not that I'm advocating fraud or anything like that, but I had created basically a temporary license because they give you these temporary licenses that are just on paper from the United States. And I was able to use that in Mexico to rent a car. So you can look at it like this. And yeah, absolutely, that was fraud. Nobody was harmed by it, right? It's not a Ponzi scheme or, I wasn't selling securities that weren't backed by anything like the Federal Reserve does or something. But, technically this was fraud, but they don't really care down here. In fact, I've been stopped in Mexico for, so Mexico's a little bit different, right? They don't have Bill of Rights. Their laws are different. And, they're tyrants. If they say you have to do this, you have to do this. So I was driving a car in Mexico that was registered, but was expired. And they pulled me over for it. And it's usually an extortion racket. But I told him I don't have a driver's license. And he said, oh, also you can't have tinted windows here. And also your registration expired. Now, this officer told me straight up, he's like, look, I don't care about the driver's license. I don't care about the tinted windows, but your registration is expired. And I guess they have a huge problem with auto theft down there. So they really like to crack down on that. And they confiscate cars just for having expired registration. That's just the way it is. And it's, as much as I don't agree with it or don't like it, that's, we can talk again, we can talk about what's legal, what's practical terms and everything else, what rights are, property rights and all this other stuff. But at the end of the day, that's what they do. And I didn't have enough cash on me to bribe him. So, cause that's also how Mexico works. So they ended up taking the car and, it's a funny story because I went to go pay the ticket. First I went to go pay the registration, which was nothing, like $100, not even. Then I went back to the police and, I paid them and I asked for a receipt and he said, oh, I can't give you the receipt because the cash box is closed, which basically meant he stuck that money in his pocket, So, but he signed the release so that I could go get the car out. So, total scam, but that's just the way it is. But um, uh, sorry, I'm losing. Oh, so I think this was we were talking about the rental. So yeah, so I was able to rent it with this, basically fake ID, and and this was interesting. They actually gave me a car that didn't have any license plates on it. And apparently in Mexico, what they do is if you get stopped and they give you a ticket, they take your license plates because they know most people aren't going to go pay the ticket. They're going to say, screw you guys. They're just going to keep driving. So what they do is they make you, it's supposedly if you see a car without license plates, they're supposed to stop you and harass you as if you have a ticket that you haven't paid. So, they make you go and pay your ticket and get your license plate back. Interestingly enough, at the time that I was doing this, I was actually renting an Airbnb, and the guy who rented it to me lived upstairs, and I saw a police officer at his door, and I was like, that's weird. So I asked him about it the next day, and he's like, oh, that's me. I'm actually a police officer during the day. And I was like, oh, really? Interesting. And then he tells me like, yeah, so if you ever get in trouble, he's like, especially since your car doesn't have a license plate on it, if you ever get in trouble, just give me a call. And he works specifically in the transit department. Um, but it was so I'm like, okay, that's interesting. But so he pointed out like, yeah, you don't have any license plate, but he didn't care because he's renting me an Airbnb, right? He's not going to give me a ticket right there. Um, but so it's interesting to see, I guess this is a country that's more known for its corruption, but it's like you go back to the US and it's like, no, everything's just as corrupt. It's just that it's not the police at the public facing front line that's corrupt. Those people, they keep, in line, follow all these rules. As soon as you pull a car over, radio it in so we can, audit how many people you stopped and where are all the tickets. Instead, in the US, the corruption's higher up. It's in the courts, it's in the politicians. And I mean, I guess in Mexico it's there too, um, but it's countries like the United States have a more digital infrastructure, so they keep everything together, they track everything better, and it locks us in a little bit more and makes us a little bit more frustrated. But at the same time, it makes things, the fact that they've eliminated the corruption from the front line kind of makes things a little bit more rigid. So now instead of having corrupt courts, what they do is, and the courts are still corrupt, but they they export their corruption to these fake courts that we talked about earlier, where it's not a real judge, and that basically relieves the real judges from having to make bad calls and basically say everybody's guilty when no evidence has even been presented. So yeah, so it's really interesting. At the end of the day, and I don't say this to discourage people, but at the end of the day, might makes right. If the government's bigger and badder and stronger and they make all the rules, then of course whatever they say goes. Like they could change the whole constitution if they want. What are we going to do? Revolt? I mean, maybe, but just look at what people are taking. Nobody's ready for a revolution. They say they are, but what are they actually going to do? Um, so unfortunately, might makes right, but at the same time, they want to be the reason that so many people respect the system that is because it gives off the presence of non-corruption and authority. Like people believe the system is legitimate. And so they do, to some degree, have to keep that facade. And they do that by ensuring that, especially the higher courts, have less corruption and they have to justify all the decisions that they make. And the lower courts have to follow those decisions. And so we do still have some sort of rule of law, even though, they kind of stretch and bend it to fit their needs whenever they like. But they're there. And so, we kind of have to take advantage of it, but we still have to push back and we still have to ask all these questions and keep them in place. Otherwise, they will get out of control. I mean, they have, but we need to keep them in place more than like better than we have been doing. But if we don't do that, they'll just trample all over us.
I have a final one on the car one because the guy that I know, he's got a bond for his insurance. And, you mentioned no insurance. And I know there's a kind of a common insurance policy if someone has an accident that doesn't have the insurance. But we don't want the system, we don't want people doing that either because, like, have you figured out a way of doing a bond or anything like that to insure yourself rather than everybody deciding deregister the car and not having an insurance.
You mean what would a public system be so that if everybody stopped doing that, we'd still be able to protect ourselves? Or are you saying
Yeah, it's like basically like, you don't have an insurance as such, right? So if you have an accident with me, you're at fault. It's different if I'm at fault, but if you're at fault, I'm supposed to get my car fixed from your insurance. But I know that
right?
in some countries there's a kind of common fund that's put aside for people that don't have insurance, but we don't want a system of that
Interesting.
because yeah. So I'm just curious that
Yeah, I mean, look, in insurance, this is the thing with insurance. It's kind of a good idea, but it's also a scam and it's also a gamble, right? Like it's first of all, when this is something I learned early in when I got my first car, somebody backed into it and I had like a really small dent in it, right? But it was on a fender, which was a piece of metal. And I remember I went to a body shop in Santa Monica, California, it's kind of it's not Beverly Hills, but it's a more expensive part of town. And I went to a body shop and they gave me some quote that was like thousands of dollars, which was like, especially for me, I was still a teenager. I'm like, I don't have that kind of money, right? Um, but then I went to the other side of town and I had somebody fix it for a couple $100 and it looked great. So what I learned is that the expensive sides of town, the reason everything is so much more expensive is because they're billing insurance, right? It's the same way the healthcare system works. Like when they know there's insurance that has to pay, they know they can charge an arm and a leg. And so, they gave me this price expecting like, first of all, somebody's insurance is paying for it. The person who hit me, they're going to pay for it with their insurance. So, we can charge whatever we want. We're not just going to pull the dent out and, buff it out and repaint it. We're going to take the entire piece off, which isn't necessary. And all the pieces on the bottom, like the wheel well and like all these plastic bits around, we're going to charge $30 to put, per each new screw that's going to go in there. And they just inflate the price. So insurance actually inflates prices. But to increase this, they've made insurance mandatory. And they don't do this to benefit the repair companies, right? They did it just to ensure that everyone's buying their product, which is insurance. But the side effect has been that makes all the prices come up. So yeah, it's all ultimately a scam and it's all gambling. In reality, what a lot of people can and have done is, and this is even codified into a lot of the states where if you have money set aside and it's the minimum amount. So the minimum coverage for an accident is something like 30 or $50,000. If you have that money set aside, then you just need proof that you have that money and you're insured. So if you ever get into an accident, you can just pay for it, right? Because my parents were always trying to terrify me at this when I first got my car, right? Especially in Los Angeles, what happens if you crash into a Mercedes, right? They're like, we're gonna lose the house, right? That's their thought. And sure, there are really terrible accidents out there where, people died, lots of property damage and everything else. But what people don't realize is like 90% of the car accidents are small and they're not very expensive. So we're paying all this insurance so we can all have, 50, 100, $1 million in coverage. But it's like none of that really gets used and these insurance companies are just raking it in. So are there alternatives? Sure, you can still have insurance. And maybe there's even like a blockchain solution where it's like money that's being staked and then you have some sort of public system that can, verify and vote on whether or not there should be a payout, things like that. There's all kinds of interesting solutions, but basically forcing people to participate in any of them it creates all this corruption and false profits and everything else. But this is another interesting thing too that I think that we should consider when we're talking about this is um when you decide to like get in your car and get out there on the road, like the road is a dangerous place, right? Let's just all like agree, okay, sure, it's a dangerous place. You're getting in your car and you're getting out there. You could get hit by another car. You could get struck by lightning, right? Like the world itself is a dangerous place. So if you're that concerned that something bad might happen, get your own insurance and insure against somebody hitting you, and don't worry about everybody else. Don't worry about whether they have insurance or licenses or anything else. Now, of course, if you see someone on the road and they're driving, dangerously, sure, get them off the road. But if they're going a little bit faster or a little bit slower, and like I know it's aggravating to see that sometimes, it's not, it's not creating an actual danger to anybody. So, but we can take responsibility for our own lives, and I think that's probably the most important way to look at it. Like, don't force people to have insurance in case they hit me. I'm going to insure myself. Like, I mean, think about it. If you get, a lot of people drive bigger cars because they're safer, or cars with more airbags. That's you buying your own insurance against somebody else, right? Like, why not just drive around in a little go-kart? Because you have this extra like wall of protection all around you, right? To protect you from other drivers. That's you taking responsibility for potentially other bad drivers. You could do that financially as well.
And with the insurance, I mean, all different insurance I've seen, how fraudulent. I saw somebody recently in the States, and they assumed that they weren't insured, and they got a bill of something like $600. I forget what the case was. And then they realized he was insured, and it became 2,000 and odd, and it was only 1,100 that was deductible. So then it became 1,400, and the guy recorded it. And your man was saying, "No, he says, can you not just revert it and everything?" So it's just proven it. And I've had
So he just
legitimate,
had insurance and the bill went up, and the
yeah, because they thought he didn't, and it more than doubled. And even just like here recently, I don't have insurance here, and I had the accident, so I had an ambulance. They done an MRI, they done X-rays and everything, and I was expecting, oh, what's this going to cost? And it was less than $300, and I was like, but I know that if I had insurance, that would be totally different. Like, and we'd be probably caught for it. I've had legitimate case. Took my son to Spain, and our car was broken into. All our luggage and everything was robbed. Insurance wouldn't cover it. I had another health thing that happened to me, and I was insured by the travel company. They didn't pay out. And every time I'm talking to somebody, they're constantly not paying out. So it's a pet peeve for me, because now
yeah,
they're using AI as well not to pay it out. So people are paying into this all their life just to protect themselves, and they're not getting covered. So, like, as you
yeah.
mentioned, like a blockchain solution would actually be the best thing, instead of lining the pockets of, the few selected.
Yeah. Yeah, I had a friend who was like, he loved, I don't want to say the name, but he loved this insurance company. And I'm like, man, I've heard really bad things about him. He's like, no, I've had him for years, house insurance, right? And he owned a couple different houses, and he's like, they're great, they're great. I love them. I love them. And I'm like, when's the last time you had a claim? And he's like, oh, I've never had to make a claim. So he's like, he loves them, but he's been paying the money and never getting anything back. Incidentally, a couple months later, he had a water heater blow up, leaked everywhere, water damage and everything on the floor. And he said they refused to pay him. And I'm like, you've been paying them all these years, probably 10 times more than what you were asking to fix your floor from this water damage. And they refused. Like, that's insane. And you just took it, and you probably still stick with that company, and you still pay them. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
scam.
So just kind of, because we're awakening and crypto. So I know you kind of touched on the blockchain. We've slightly mentioned it there with the insurance, but regarding the financial side of things, because it's one that, everyone's trying to create something that gets away from the Fed. Like they have the printing press, and some people saying, "Oh, Bitcoin is the way to go." But the reality is, every cryptocurrency that was created, they can just buy what they want and control it, and they can even manipulate some of them depending on the percentage they owe. And the only way that I can see it being done is that you have a system that's created that steps away from that, because if you can buy stuff with fiat currency, it's not going to work. And I'm just
Right.
curious your thoughts on how we actually fix the system.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of there's I mean, look, you have people who benefit from pretty much absolute control of the world, and they've been able to do that just by printing money, by controlling the money supply. And so, if something comes along right? They're sitting on the top of this empire. If something comes along that threatens that, they're not just gonna be like, oh, Bitcoin, okay, that's cool, and let Bitcoin take over, and like their fiat system is just gone. Well, it was a good run. No, they're going to find some way to try to control it or replace it or, something else. And so we have the CBDCs. We have, there's a lot of theories about whether they're trying to take over Bitcoin. At least they're using AI to analyze the blockchain and still use it to track what they can't track through the banking system. Um, I've become a big fan of Monero, just because it's, it's, I'm a software engineer, so I probably should spend more time looking at source code, but I haven't. But from what I understand about how all the different coins work, but not only that, but also like adoption and history and how they're actually functioning in the world, Monero's kind of become the um, the top coin for me that I think is actually posing a threat to the system. And I say that because that's the one that everybody wants to ban. Like this is the one that's, you used to be able to buy it on a few different exchanges and now you can't get it anywhere. DeFi is the only way to get it. Um, and I think even they were facing a threat. A few months ago, they were worried about, somebody was setting up too many servers. And so they were calling on the community to set up nodes. I've got my node running right over here. Because it is based on like a voting system, and Bitcoin faces the same threat. If you have one company that controls 51% of the network, you could technically take it over. And whether you fork it or not, well, if most of the people are on that fork, like that's the main fork, right? Um, so yeah, there are all kinds of potential threats, but I think that's a really interesting point about the whole thing is that like we need to set up our own nodes basically says we need to take responsibility for our money. We can't just like trust, like even if it is blockchain, we can't just like pick a blockchain and say like, hey, we're going to trust the entire system just to work because there's other people who know what they're doing. Like we still need to participate. It's like with government. If we were to say like, I'm not going to vote, I'm just going to let them do whatever they want because I trust them, like that's like everyone can see that's a terrible idea, I hope. And it's the same thing with our money, right? And so running a node is actually participating in the system, and it's ensuring that, if somebody comes up with like a new change to the code that says we're going to implement this new feature, that, we have an opportunity to basically vote and say yes or no. We're not going to accept that. Because, like a lot of people are fixated on the fact that like Bitcoin is, they say it's non-inflationary, which isn't really true. It is inflationary, right? Like the fact, and I know it decays over time, but the fact that each new block creates new Bitcoin means it's inflationary. It's limited, right? There's not one guy sitting in a room somewhere that can say, okay, we're going to print 50 trillion Bitcoins today, right? And there's also a cap of 21 million. But, if somebody controls the entire network, they can still change that number, right? Like technically you can change that number and say, and they can make some excuse for it. And we've already seen, there's a great book. Actually, I see it on your shelf back there, Hijacking Bitcoin.
Yeah,
Um,
it's fascinating,
and
actually.
yeah, and it explains how like they don't really talk about that particular issue, I don't think, but they do talk about how, one organization of a relatively small group of people could make that decision and it would affect everybody else. Um, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that, we're not running our own nodes, and we're also not checking where the software comes from or what updates we're pulling. If we just automatically pull updates every time, then it's like whoever's making the updates can send us whatever they want, and our system will just download it without us even paying attention. So that's an important part of it too. And I realize, for most people, especially your listeners, we're probably above average as far as it goes with the information on this type of stuff. The average, you think about the average uninformed voter, who might not even understand what a blockchain is. They're probably not going to participate in this. But if we can create ways, and I think this is one of the most important things that we need to do, with just crypto technology altogether, is we need to find better ways to get people to incorporate it and understand it, because ultimately we have an adoption problem, right? I hear people all the time saying, "Yeah, Bitcoin sounds cool because it's not fiat." Like that's all they get about it. But I can't buy my groceries with it. And it doesn't take much. In fact, some point of sale manufacturers are starting to do this, where they're adding in software that accepts Bitcoin and it just converts it immediately to fiat for the store owner, because that's what they want. Um, like it's a bridge, right? And we need all these bridges and shims and everything else to create this mass adoption. We need to make it easy for people. And especially like when we talk about, the scammers out there trying to get people's seed phrases or private keys. Like in order to really be secure with crypto, it is kind of difficult. We have to acknowledge that, and we have to like figure out ways to make this easier for people, because we need people who are completely technologically illiterate to be able to adopt crypto and use it in their lives. Because if they don't, then it's like we're just a bunch of weirdos who are using it, right? And it's still separate from the system. The government's going to roll out something else, and they're just going to accept it. They might roll out a CBDC where it's like people don't even have digital wallets. They're still relying on a bank to hold it for them. Because, at least with the bank, they can just show their ID and, okay, we'll reset your password for you. Like that's a really important part. So I like to emphasize that for a lot of people. But yeah, sorry if I'm
No, but like I've had a guest on Meta was her name, and Arbitrum, I believe, is the company. It's in Uzbekistan, and they're trying to do it that they have the card as well, and they're trying to have rates that are kind of similar to like Revolut. But when I tried to do it there, it's not ready in Poland yet, so I'm just waiting for it just to see. And I think that's what it is. It's just simplifying it, but at the same time protecting you, because you mentioned it earlier, KYC. Like it was MEX, MEXC that I was using, and then they said, "Oh, it's blocked. You need to give more." I spent over a month, and in the end, I had to hold up my card. I was blocking the 3 digits and hold up my passport in one picture, and then upload bank statements for 3 months. And I was like, they have no right for that. Like, who are they to be seeing my transactions? It's nothing to do with them. But my money was blocked unless I'd done it. And that frustrates me. And every single thing is like that. I mean, if I want to buy crypto in the morning, no problem. Yeah, you go in, you debit card, credit card, anything, transfer money from your bank. But when you want to reverse it, it is very difficult. And then, yeah, you can use like these kind of Bitcoin ATMs, which uses you change it to Tether, but they're like PayPal. They're taking about 4%. And I watch every penny. It's like, why are they getting 4%? It's like, that's not right either. And, so the whole system is not right. And the problem is now, like, say you've got Revolut, Wise, and all these for normal, beating the banks with rates and stuff like that. But it's like the Wild West, and you can't trust all of them. And I think it's the same thing is happening now. Everyone has seen an opportunity, and there'll be a lot of people get caught because, unfortunately, there's a lot of fraudsters out there. Doesn't matter what level they're at. And it's going to be, you have to kind of keep your eye on who to trust.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's unfortunate, and they put a lot of those rules in place. They say it's know your customer, anti-money laundering, and it's like look, the number of people that you guys are after that are laundering money, or massive drug cartel people, how many of them are there? A couple thousand maybe.
It's usually the governments. It's usually the governments. Either it's usually HNBC or all these English banks and everything. It's always themselves that are doing it, So it's not drug lords and stuff like that, but yet everybody has to go through these.
Yeah, processes. Hundreds of millions of billions of us have to play by these other rules, and it's like, no, this isn't about anti-money laundering. This is about taxes. Like, you want to track all of our transactions so that we're this is what's interesting too. Like, at least in the US, right? The IRS isn't going around looking into people's bank accounts, and they can't anyways, because the whole way that the income tax works here is, when you file, you're basically saying this was a taxable transaction, right? Because let's say I lend you $100 and you pay me back, you don't have to declare $100 as income, and the $100 you give back to me, I don't have to declare that because it's not income, right? So they can't look at our bank accounts and just assume that every transaction coming in is income. So they need us to file and declare. But what they do is, because, this isn't what they do, but everyone believes that they're monitoring all these bank accounts, especially, they had a law last year that said now any bank account that has more than $600, which wasn't even the rule, but that's what the propaganda said, right? So people are like thinking like, oh, they're monitoring my bank accounts. I better make sure to declare every single penny because I don't want them coming after me and sending me to jail. And so like all of these things are in place. They don't have to monitor our bank accounts. They've got people so afraid that they're reporting everything. And this is like, you know, as much as they say, oh, we're going to increase taxes on the rich and everything else. And I know, people on the left would love that. The reality is that's not who they're like. There's only a few rich people compared, I mean, there's a lot, but there's only a few relative to the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is who pays all the most amount of money in taxes. In the US, it's like, it's a majority. It's like 80% of all the taxes they collect come from the poor, right? And it's because there's hundreds of millions of them, right? Like you take a small amount from 100 million people, that's a lot more money than any wealthy person has. Um, and so they've tricked everybody. So these laws are not in place for the major drug dealers and everything else. They're in place for the average Joe just to make sure that he sends all his money so they can extract every single penny they can from us. Because they know that's the cash cow. That's where the bulk of the money comes from.
And is it all down to declaration? Because, I believe it's over 10 years or something like that, that you haven't paid tax. So I suppose everybody doesn't want to pay tax. They're all kind of going, how do we do this? So what's the best way to stop
Yeah.
Uncle Sam taking part of your dinner?
So every place is a little bit different, but I've some Canadians have asked me, and I've looked into a little bit, and I see the same words there, voluntary compliance on the Canadian tax system, which is that's how the entire U.S. system is based. Voluntary compliance, they call it. And I can speak a little bit to why we have it in the U.S., but of course, every place is different. But um, I guess I can say this: a lot of governments get together, and they have conferences, they have meetings, and they trade notes, right? So they learn from each other. Like, oh, they're doing this over there. Oh, this is how it works. They have like industry meetings like this. It's why every country around the world uses this. There's a handful of different guns that they all use, right? Um, and so I can definitely speak to how it works in the U.S., which is we have Fourth and Fifth Amendment protections, which basically says you don't have to testify against yourself. Any tax form that you send to the IRS can be used against you. So it would seem that you're violating your own rights by filing these taxes and paying these taxes. What they do is they say it's voluntary so that they don't have that charge, right? Now, of course, everyone's like, yeah, but it's not voluntary because I have to pay the tax or I'm going to go to jail. Well, this is the thing. Imagine you're driving in your car and you get pulled over. The cop comes to your window and says, do you know how fast you were going? And you say, well, if you don't remember, I'm not going to tell you, right? So you keep your mouth shut. But then your passenger says, yes, officer, I saw he was going 75 and speed limit's 35. Yeah, he was going 75. He was definitely speeding. There's a witness, a snitch, right? Who basically says, no, you're going to get that ticket. Now, the IRS works in the same way because they know everyone could just say, I'm not going to declare it. The IRS can't come along and declare it because they're not witnessing the transaction. They're not a part of it. They don't know, like I mentioned, $100. If I lend you 100 and you give it back to me, if they were to see me receiving $100, they can't say it's taxable because they don't know why I'm receiving it. Is it a loan repayment or is it capital gains? What's it for? They would have to swear under oath that it is a taxable transaction, which means it's something of that nature. And they can't do that because they don't know. So what they do is they rely on the person who pays me. So that would be you or my employer or my, if I'm getting dividends from stock, my broker, right? They're expecting them to report this, right? And when they report it under penalty of perjury and say this is a taxable transaction. So essentially, and there's a lot more paperwork and bureaucracy to it, but essentially what I do is I go back to the IRS and I say, I understand that somebody swore under penalty of perjury, under oath, that they gave me money in part of a taxable transaction, but I'm disputing that that is valid. I have a problem with that, and I'm swearing under penalty of perjury that when they say it was taxable, I say it was not. So now the IRS has a problem where they say, okay, how do we know? How do we know this is taxable or not? Now they can drag someone from the broker into court, or somebody from my company, from the HR department, into court, and have them say, testify, yes, it was a taxable transaction. Okay, well, is that a matter of fact or is that a matter of opinion? It's actually a matter of opinion. That they gave me money was a fact, right? But whether or not it was taxable is a matter of opinion as to whether, and even a court's ruling is called an opinion. So, its opinion is stronger than just like, I think it is, right? Um, but in order for them to say, I swear that it was taxable, they need to understand the tax code, right? Which means any of these people would have to explain the tax code. And most lawyers can't explain the tax code. The government can't, the IRS can't explain the tax code. There's a lot of misinformation even on the IRS website. For example, they say the 16th Amendment allowed Congress to create a direct tax, when there are Supreme Court rulings that say, no, actually the Sixth Amendment says the income tax is not a direct tax. The Supreme Court says, they've said this for the last 100 years, and the IRS still has it on their website that it's a direct tax, which is wrong. But they also say on their website, you know, um, uh, that any advice you get from the IRS is really just it's really just it's not meaningful. You can't take their advice to court and say, oh well, they told me this, because what matters in court is the law. And they say this on their website, right? So you can't trust any information that's on their website. Um, and so basically that's the whole scam. So I simply tell them, no, you have the snitch, and I say the snitch is lying. And they basically say, okay, well, I guess we don't have any evidence to say that you received any taxable income. And they send me back a notice saying, okay, we've adjusted, the taxes that we think you owe, and you owe us nothing. Or they'll even send me a full refund of everything that's been withheld. And this is not, anything I discovered on my own. There have been a lot of people who have been, chipping away at the system to really understand how this tax works over the past, man, I would say it's been 50 years now. Erwin Schiff was one of the early pioneers of this, and he ended up dying in prison because he got plenty of things wrong, but he was a pioneer. When he first started this, there was no internet. There weren't even searchable PDFs. He had, the book, which was the tax law, which was this massive book, and he's reading through it, trying to understand it and make sense of it. And court cases, right, which are even harder to search because they're like even more volumes, right? But he was able to get a lot of really great information, and others kind of built on it and learned from it. And then not only learned the law and how it actually works and why we shouldn't pay, but because there's that to it, right? This isn't just a trick. The law actually supports that they can't tax our income the way they do, but then also to understand the bureaucratic system so that you can figure out how to get them to just agree, instead of trying to fight you back and forth on it all day and say, yes, you do have to pay, you do, which is what they'll do. If you get into an argument with them, they'll argue with you until you give up and just decide to pay. But if you follow the right path, it's like there's no argument for that. They don't have a counter argument yet. They like to change things and evolve and advance and try to figure out ways to make it more difficult for us. But this is something they haven't figured out a response to this one yet. So that's really how it works.
And regarding, because like in most of European countries, VAT is 23%. So they're getting their tax on that. And if you're buying it as an individual, if you buy it as a company, but then your cost, either corporation tax or dividend when you're paying yourself. But like say petrol as well, because there's so much taxes on that. Is there
Right.
ways of reclaiming any of that when you're going down the kind of the road that you're taking?
I haven't found any, but because it's basically you're not in charge of the tax. You're not paying it, and so even if the person who paid it overpaid, you're not entitled to get any back because you're not the one paying it, right? At the same time, so as an entrepreneur, I have I've some e-commerce businesses. I don't charge sales tax there, and uh, I guess worldwide, I don't charge sales tax, but I guess they're starting to do things now where if you ship to other countries, they want you to, but they have no jurisdiction. So what are they going to do? Come to the U.S. and sue me over, $5 that, that I would have paid in tax for that one order. But as far as the US goes, so they actually spent like a good 10 or 20 years trying to get the sales tax to work across states for online orders, because it used to be you would only pay if you shipped to your own state, and outside of that you wouldn't have to. Um, but my understanding of how this tax works, and no one's come to challenge me on it, it's not to say they won't, is that and you look at all these different states and cities and everything, you have to apply for a sales tax permit. And so there are these third-party systems that will basically do that for you. So if you say, I'm shipping an order to this city, they'll say, okay, how much is it? They'll track the tax. They'll tell you how much to charge. And then they want you to give them the money, and then they'll give it to the city. And they have contracts with like all these cities. But I don't want to participate in that, right? So I'm not legally, especially like in places, New York, I cannot collect sales tax from New York because I don't have a license to do. I'd be breaking the law if I collected sales tax in New York, right? Unless I went there and applied for that permit or did it through this third party thing. But I don't want to do that. Now, New York might say, okay, but if you're going to ship stuff to New York, you have to do that. Well, they'll tell me that. And the government tells you you have to do things all the time, but that doesn't mean you have to do it. It's just like the IRS, right? They can put misinformation on their website, but that's not the law, right? And so my understanding is, especially the way these laws are written, is that California, for example, says this tax is on the privilege of selling products in our state. Well, how is that a privilege? I thought that was a right. Like, I have a right to own property. I have a right to trade that property with other people. These are rights. That's not a privilege, right? And so my understanding of it is that the privilege only applies to privileged sales, which is if I have a foreign corporation, for example, or even a corporation. And interestingly, the Supreme Court has ruled, as much as we hear about, what is it? People United, what's it called? The case where they say corporations are persons. We hear a lot about that, but in reality, the Supreme Court's already said corporations are entities of the state. They were created by the state. It's a privilege to operate as a corporation, and therefore you don't have Fourth and Fifth Amendment protections. So if they want to see your books, you have to show them, right? This is like, you don't have any privacy with a corporation. As an individual, you do. So interestingly enough, you look back at like all the cases when they were, going to the Supreme Court and trying to get, all these people to pay these, interstate sales taxes now for online purchases or for shipping purchases. And these were all corporations, which is interesting because as an individual, like, I'm just exercising a right to trade property, rights that I have that a corporation might not have. Like the courts will even say that the 14th Amendment applies to people, but it doesn't apply to corporations. So I go to any state and the law must treat me equally, but that doesn't apply to corporations. They don't have to treat you equally as a corporation. So if I have rights in that state, if I were a citizen of that state and I can own property and trade property, then I wouldn't have to pay that tax. So that's the philosophy that I go by. And so I don't charge sales tax on any of my websites, and I refuse to pay them. Now, as a software engineer at my day job, like, it's interesting to see that they even collect. It's a U.S. based company, but depending on what state they sell to, and it's virtual products, right? Video streaming, that kind of content. If they sell it to somebody in Mexico or Brazil, they're required to put in their tax ID to, connect. Like, that's the government policy. Now, of course, they're operating as a corporation, and and again, different countries might be more authoritarian and say, you don't even have rights as an individual not to charge these taxes or not to collect that information. But the bigger they are, these bigger corporations, they're always afraid of governments, right? What if we get kicked out of that country? What if they seize our bank accounts or, do something? So they always play it safe and play by the rules, even when it's not required. But as a corporation, they are required to do certain, more things. But anyways, so back to your point about the taxes. Actually, let me say one more interesting thing about that. The Supreme Court has ruled in the US that once you pay a tax, like, that's the end of the transaction. So right now they're dealing with a lot of fraud, with government, just giving out money to all kinds of programs that don't even really exist, daycares that aren't really daycares, millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. And the government basically says, well, you can't sue us over how we spend your money because it's not your money. Our transaction ended when you paid the tax. And so they basically say you have no standing, which means you have no reason to be in this court on this issue because you're not a part of the transaction, the fraud, right? You paid the tax and that's it. What that also means is, going back to the gas tax, someone else paid the gas tax. If they wanted to sue the government and try to challenge that on something, then that's their responsibility. You're not the one who wrote the check to the government, so you have no standing. You can't sue them. And so it's interesting that that is, that it basically takes the responsibility away from the consumer and puts it on these bigger businesses, which if you think about what they're actually doing, they're going after the larger arteries of the money, right? Like it doesn't make any sense to like go to every, hundreds of millions of people in whatever country you're in and say like, hey, every single one of you give us, $2 here, $1 here. Why not just go to the, strike the root, go to the trunk of the tree and just, stick a tap in and pull it out there, because then you just have one person writing you a check for tens of millions of dollars instead of going after all these little people. Most of them are trying to dodge you, but it's like you've got this one big guy right here, and where's he going to run to, right? So that's kind of part of the design, and it's yeah, it's done that way on purpose. And I think even in the U.S., there's kind of a movement to shift towards that. Like a lot of people have been talking about a flat tax or a fair tax, national sales tax, but it's I guess they just haven't gotten the support. I think people are already pissed off that the income tax is so much, and they're like a lot of people are just ready to get rid of it. But yeah, so it's yeah, there's a lot of different aspects to look at with all these taxes.
And just curious, because I had a bond at one stage and insurance, and in Ireland once, like I'm living in Poland, but once you hit 50, you're able to kind of get your self-contributing pension, and there's 25% is tax free, and then they tax the rest at 50%. And just through my own knowledge, I got every penny back off them on both cases.
Nice.
And I'm just wondering, because I understand now a lot more than I did, when I was paying into, when I was working in Ireland and everything. Have you come across a situation where people who had paid, and not with the VAT, no, but who had paid income tax, that was able to backdate it and get back money that they previously paid? Or is it goodbye as soon as they have your money?
Yeah. So the best I've seen, so like, yeah, if you file and it's like for a past year, you can't later go back, because basically what you'd be doing is saying, especially the system I'm doing is look, I confessed that my income was taxable, but now I'm changing my mind for a previous year. So I haven't seen anyone be able to do that. But I have seen a lot of people do, which is what I do. I've seen them do it for even larger amounts. But you've got when you have a regular, they call it a W-2 job, which is like a regular employee kind of arrangement. So they do withholding, which is supposed to be an advance payment for the income tax, but then there are other taxes, right? There's Medicare, Social Security, federal unemployment insurance, and all these other things, which are technically separate taxes, which nobody is supposed to get back. So at the end of the year, even if you like say like I have 1 million deductions, I don't owe any tax, give me back, the money that I deposited, you'll never see the Medicare or anything else. But doing it the way that we do it, which is to say that like, no, that was all submitted in error. Those taxes actually do get refunded. So that might be the closest to what you're talking about. But if you, and you can do this like retroactively, right? So, when I first started doing this, there were, I hadn't paid taxes for 5 years, but I hadn't submitted anything. So they were still, they were getting ready to start sending letters and asking for money. But I was able to go back and basically handle those years that had been unhandled. But the years before that were already handled and done with, they're like, you can't touch them. And it wouldn't even matter if it was, just 1 year ago. It has nothing to do with how far it is in the past. It has to do with, you've already signed the confession form. and agreed, that's done, that's settled, that's gone. So yeah, there's that. But
No.
I think, yeah.
No. And listen, we haven't even touched like the Federal Reserve and everything. So I'll have to get you back and go into that because this is all
Yeah.
fascinating. And I mean, like I've read your book, I've enjoyed your book. So like
Thank
the
you.
best thing is that we'll do that on another episode because it'll just go so deep. So you might let the listeners know where they can find you, and then we'll do a follow up, and people can then write their questions to me as well that I can actually cover the next time that you're back.
Yeah, absolutely. So taxationistheft.info is where I have a lot of, there's a lot of free information. So actually, if you go to taxationistheft.info/free, there's a free download where you can get information on how to not pay income tax. There's some disclaimers in there that'll explain, what the conditions are. If you're working for the government, for example, it's not going to work. But there's some free information there. There's also a message board on there. So people, they post questions, people who are actively, trying to start pushing back. And I leave it open to questions for everything, any kind of tax, sales tax, driver's licenses, everything else. So it's a really great resource. It's new, but it's growing. So I definitely encourage people to check that out. And then there's some other merchandise and cool stuff on there, but also the books are available there. So as you mentioned, there's Crash the Fed, and then there's another book, Taxation Is Theft: How Politicians Rob You Blind, and it kind of goes through all the taxes and how they manipulate us and how much they're taking. Because there's so much to learn about it. It's a lot of information, and it's all fraud and corruption at the end of the day. So it questions the morality of taxation, and there's some other interesting points in there too. Those books are also available on Amazon. Crash the Fed, the audiobook, is out now on Audible, and the Taxation Is Theft: How Politicians Rob You Blind audiobook should be out pretty soon too. Yeah, and then also I'm on X, which there's a lot of it's X, so there's a lot of shit posting, but there's a lot of politics and taxes and everything else on there too. So if you're interested in that, you can find me at it's at Dan for Texas, FOR Texas.
Okay. No, and I'll make sure I put all the links because I know your TikTok is good as well as your Instagram. There's some valuable information, so I'll put all the links. So thank you very much, Dan.
Absolutely.
So that's all for the crypto podcast and the meditation podcast. You'll find everything about me. Scan the QR code, go to roycon.com. If you're looking for virtual assistants, go to theat.world. I would encourage you to get this book. It'll explain things a lot more, but we'll cover that in the next episode. So be sure to give thumbs up, 5-star rating, share with your friends. And when you get the book, do the same because it just allows more people to see it. Until next week, take care.